We're back again to First Monday, this time for the second of our spring series, April 3rd, 2023. And what we've done this spring is to honor the 100th birth year of the great composer György Ligeti. Ligeti, as I've told you before, came to New England Conservatory in 1993 when he was about 70. Spent more than a week here, not only overseeing performances of his music, which we broadly played, but regaling us with his observations about life, his wit, his sense of values among people. It was a really, really miraculous visit. Last month, we talked about his interest in non-rhythmic masses of sound, that is to say, without bar lines. This time, we're still going to look at a mass of sound, but with quite a difference. In 1963, when he was 40, he conceived of a work using 100 mechanical metronomes. That's quite unusual. And they were to be set with random speeds and started all at once, which makes quite a lot of noise, 100 metronomes. And gradually, because they're mechanical wind-up metronomes, they wear down and they stop. And what happens is gradually, as that begins to take place, you begin to hear different metronomes in different parts of the mass, making polyrhythms against one another in a random fashion. And that keeps going until there are fewer and fewer of them still active, still not worn down, until finally there is one left, the survivor. And once that survivor's sound of that metronome is done, the piece is over. He had been asked to do it for Dutch radio, and the event was pre-recorded, and when the people at the radio station heard what it was, they were kind of horrified. They didn't know what to do, and they refused to broadcast it and replaced it with a live broadcast of a soccer game. He was upset, but also amused in a way, and I'm going to tell you what he wrote about that. He regarded this work as a critique of the contemporary musical situation, saying, but a special sort of critique, since the critique itself results from musical means. The verbal score is only one aspect of the critique, and it is admittedly rather ironic. The other aspect is, however, the work itself. What bothers me, Ligeti says, nowadays are above all ideologies, and all ideologies in that they are stubborn and intolerant toward others. And Poème Symphonique is directed above all against them. So I am in some measure proud that I could express criticism without any text, with music alone. And it's no accident that Poème Symphonique was rejected as much by the petit bourgeois, see the cancellation of the TV broadcast, as by the seeming radicals. Radicalism and petit bourgeois attitudes are not so far from one another. Both wear the blinkers of the narrow-minded. That's what he said about it. So now let me tell you more about the piece. It's no longer very easy to find mechanical metronomes. Everybody now has them on their phones or in some other electronic format. I actually own one that belonged to my mother, who was a pianist, born really a very long time ago. And it's at my home, and it's pyramid-shaped, and it stands there as a relic, a source of great memories for me. Anyway, when we were thinking about programming this piece, we were worried about finding 100 metronomes. And then all of a sudden we learned that one of our distinguished alums, Rodney Lister, composer, had 100 metronomes because he wanted to do this piece. And apparently over several years, whenever he found some available, he would buy them. They're all essentially the same kind, I think different makes. But we now have on hand for this concert 100 metronomes. How is it going to work? Well, Rodney teaches at NEC Prep, and he also teaches at Boston University. And he decided in this, the 100th anniversary year, it was right to have a work by that composer with 100 in it, 100 metronomes. And he did it there not long ago. So he's loaned them to us. And if you do one of the instructions, it's wind up every metronome as tight as you can, set each metronome to randomly different tempos, start them all at once. When he did it at BU, they went on for about 45 minutes. I think that's more than we need to get the point of what it's about. And so we're going to prepare them so that all of this can be done in about 15 minutes. And by the way, when Ligeti came here in 1993, we did a performance of this piece, which he was happy about. And it was impossible to find 100 metronomes. We had less than 40 of them. And we lovingly referred to this performance as the chamber version of his symphony. So, with a little humor, I'm saying that. And the final thing I'll say about it is that it's easy to dismiss this piece as a gimmick, but actually it is very profound in its own way. And I know that when coming up later this spring on June 12th, in particular, which is the exact 100th anniversary day of his birth in 1923, a performance is planned of the metronome piece. And finally, as one metronome stops like a year of his life, and of course, he didn't live to 100, but when finally the 100th one does stop, that's essentially the end, and our memorializing his great contribution to our life of music. Anyway, here it is. In 1982, Ligeti was asked to write a trio as a companion to the horn trio of Brahms. The horn trio of Brahms is for violin, horn, and piano. Ligeti therefore called his piece, written that year, as Hommage à Brahms, homage to Brahms. And he wrote, as soon as was pronounced the word horn, somewhere inside my head I heard the sound of a horn as if coming from a distant forest, in a fairy tale, just as in a poem. But Ligeti was always interested in the past, and he knew a lot about it, and he wanted to honor the past, which is homage to Brahms. But he always was interested in finding a new path. And at this time, he started on what he referred to as a third way. He claimed it was neither modern music or postmodern music. And that influenced his writing for some time. The piece is in 4 movements, just like the Brahms. And it starts tenderly, and then wildly in a mechanical scherzo, maybe thinking of the Metronomes, followed by a crazy outburst of a march, which is very short, and finally a slow lament. Harkening back to his Eastern European roots, he was born in Romania, the Hungarian part of Romania. He's written a scherzo based on another Eastern European country, Bulgaria, which has music of very, very distinct rhythmic character. Something like that. And by the way, the 5th quartet of Béla Bartók has a whole movement called Alla Bulgarese with that rhythm. What Ligeti does a little bit different is he doesn't have them playing the rhythm in unison. He has one of them starts and another one comes in 2 or 3 notes later. So it's, again, his idea of layering so that you really can't tell where the downbeat is. And the other thing is the last movement, which was Brahms's piece, was written because of the death of his mother. The last piece is also a kind of lament. The last thing to say about it is that Brahms, in writing for the piano and the violin, uses standard technical means. When it comes to the French horn, you see that original Waldhorn, as the Germans called it, wood's horn, was an instrument without those 3 valves that horn players have so they can play all the notes of the chromatic scale. And with that in mind, he wrote a French horn part, which every French hornist refers to as challenging as any piece they've ever played, which sometimes uses modern technique and sometimes slips into that no valve thing where by changing the shape of the mouth they can get different parts of the overtone series. So that, and it's not one part of the piece, just it's all back and forth. Anyway, that's just about as much as you need to know, I think, about this piece. And it is a compelling, wonderful, wonderful piece of music, and I know you're going to love hearing it. So here it is. When Ligeti came to us in 1993, we did many of his works, but he also had the chance to talk to us, and anybody who ever heard him talk remembers that as one of the defining characteristics of his personality. The liveliness, the range of knowledge, the wit with which he spoke to us in English, his 6th language, by the way, preceded by Hungarian, Romanian, German, French, Swedish, and English. So we have some of that to play for you today. But what happened that day was the very young Borromeo string quartet, still with us, thankfully, wanted help from him on his 2nd string quartet. And he agreed to do that. It was not going to be performed. He said he would just help them understand the piece. He did that. But he asked them, what else are you working on now? And they said they were working on the last string quartet of Franz Schubert in G major. He was very excited about that because there are things about how that piece is put together and how it begins that he wanted to share with them. Written in 1826, it's at the very beginning of, amazingly, what you would refer to as the last period of a man who was less than 30 years old. But tragically, Schubert died 2 years later. And what he did in that piece was so remarkable. At the usual length of Schubert, the piece is 50 minutes long, that you can't ever really understand how it came about. Great composers have little corners of their brain where something says, this is what I want people to hear. And somehow or other they manage to write it down or portray it so that we can hear it. Anyway, the piece begins with a long G major chord, which is immediately interrupted by a G minor chord. And all of Schubert's life, he was fascinated by the modality of major and minor. Kind of like the major is happy or positive, the minor is sad or troubled. And that's how the piece begins. What basically Ligeti was talking to them about was the beginning of the piece has, after the first few bars of the introduction saying major, minor, it has a slow second element of this first theme that is a descending chromatic scale, da, da, ya, da, da, based on that. And what he talked at length about that day was how Schubert created something with the harmonies of how it went each time down a half step to a whole new range of using tonal chords, which is too complicated for us to talk about here. But you can hear it, and the effect of it is so powerful that it is the driving force of this whole piece. So Ligeti, actually, he had a chalkboard and he was writing down the names of all the chords, and he had a piano and he was trying to show how the chords worked. And the one thing that really I think is very easy for us to connect to is that Ligeti, with his great deep knowledge of the past of music, and interest, by the way, in music of all parts of the globe, but in this case going back hundreds of years to other composers, in this particular case to the great English composer Henry Purcell, who wrote an opera called Dido and Aeneas. And Dido sings a lament that has the same idea of a descending half-step line. And not long ago, Isan Kim, the founding cellist and still in the Borromeo Quartet, told me about how this was a life-changing encounter with Ligeti. And that's why we have the Schubert G Major Quartet on a program celebrating Ligeti. We're lucky to have an audio recording of the event, and we can listen to some short segments from it, dealing with the opening of the first movement. It's a little hard to understand because of the sound and the talking, but if you listen to how he connects the Schubert to the lament of Dido from Purcell, you can see how much he's linked to the long span of music history. Here's a bit of him talking, and then they play the opening, and he compares that to Purcell.
I want to go to the main essential because time now only for essential things. This is the opening of the first theme of a sonata form. As you heard it has three themes. So the standard is go to tonica to the dominant, caesura, to the dominant back to the tonica. This is the grand model of a period. And this is what Schubert does here, but in a very complex way, this change of minor and major, changing a tonic major to minor was allowed in Mozart's music. Changing a dominant in minor from major was not allowed. It's got back in history in the time of the modern music before the tonality. So you have to go back to Josquin and Lasso and Palestrina to find this equality of the fifth degree in minor and major. And it went and Schubert took it back. By the way, Schubert was, as a child, as a boy, member of the Sängerknaben, of the main Viennese children's chorus, and of course we know, because the programs are there, that they sang a lot of Palestrina, Lasso, maybe also Josquin. I doubt whether earlier music, but in any case, this kind of modern thinking was known in Schubert, and he made a recombination between the tonal convention of the Haydn Mozart heritage and some pre-tonal modal possibilities. And this is the last thing which I want to explain, because his very, very new language in his last works, in the G major sonata, in the C major string quintet, in the two piano trios, in the F minor fantasy for four hands, and some other pieces, the last unfinished symphony, is based on a mixture, on a combination of conventional cadence, is it? Cadence? The conventional cadence, always alternating with, in Viennese classic times, forbidden, outworn, old-fashioned. So in fact, Schubert uses archaic elements, but he uses them in a very, very new way, which was never used in this way before. And this is what we want to look at. Thank you. Sorry. No, this is the sixth degree in minor. I'm not very good singer.
One more thing I wanted to tell you. As I was preparing all of this, preparing the season, I was in touch with Alex Ross, who is the music critic of The New Yorker. And by the way, I think no one today writes with greater insight into our musical world than Alex Ross. It's just great, clear thinking, very, very imaginative. And so we exchanged messages, and he surprised me by telling me that he was in the room at NEC when Ligeti was holding this session, and he was here for the whole week because he had been hired by the New York Times to write about Ligeti's visit to New England Conservatory. And he was so moved by what Ligeti had to say about this descending line, which he called the baseline lament, that the first book where Alex wrote, he wrote an entire chapter about that descending line and about the various people, including Ligeti, who had used it. So I think that's just wonderful. But I also want to tell you just a little bit more about the quartet, just a little bit. I've told you already it's long. I never mind the length of Schubert. When I play his two-cello quintet, by the way, and I get to the end, which is another 50-minute piece, my instinct, which I've never done, to be honest, is to turn back to the first page and play the entire piece all over again. Because when you're playing that music, you are in a very special place and you don't want to leave it. Anyway, after this first movement, which is all about that major-minor thing, and with a lot of tremolos and very exciting elements, comes a slow movement that starts off seeming kind of beautiful, but not unexpected. It starts with a beautiful cello melody in a minor key that seems nostalgic. And then something crazy happens. All of a sudden, there is something in a completely different key. Da-da! And you just don't know where that came from. And it keeps doing that he moves through different keys, always with a da-da. Something is very, very wrong. Something is very upsetting. And where does it come from? That's what composers do. They hear things that we haven't heard yet, and they bring them to us. And there are two more wonderful movements. The last one is very energetic. It is a long piece. It's a hard piece to play, but it's profound, deeply touching, and as great as any music ever becomes. So now, after 30 years, here we are again with the Poème Quartet. They're 30 years older. Some people in the quartet are not the same as at the beginning, but Nicholas Kitchen and Isan, husband and wife, are still with us. And they carry with them into this performance what Ligeti taught them. Let's listen to it.